We are now joined by Paul Tough, author of How Children Succeed. So Paul, in your book you have clearly challenged common beliefs on intelligence and IQ often measured by tests by saying that it is non-cognitive skills that matter. So how can character skills like perseverance, curiosity, conscientiousness, optimism and self-control that you have mentioned be main indicators of success?
Well, the reason I think that the scientists and educators who I wrote about in the book have identified these as being important contributors is just from the evidence, from the data. So that there's this new emerging set of papers and studies that shows that when we just measure students only by their cognitive skills, by how well they do on standardized tests of math and literacy, those tests aren't necessarily good predictors of who is going to succeed in the long run. But looking at these non-cognitive skills, at an ability to persevere, at possessing curiosity, those correspond more in adulthood with the kind of success that we care about.
So we are not completely dismissing the cognitive skills as indicators,
right,
but they are just indicators to a certain level?
Well, I think what's true is that the best way to assess students is to do both, is to have those two sides of our brains in balance. But I think what has happened in most education systems, especially over the last couple of decades, is that the pendulum has swung all the way towards the cognitive side of the equation. And so we are assessing students entirely using those cognitive measures. We're incentivizing teachers and school systems entirely based on how well students do on these cognitive-based tests. And as a result, we're leaving out this whole side of the skill equation, and it happens to be a side that matters a great deal in terms of the success of students.
As you said that it is based on science and research, can you speak more about the evidence that proves it? For example, the marshmallow experiment.
Sure. So the marshmallow test I don't think is the most rigorous assessment that's been done, but it's certainly one that gets people's attention, and it is a great one in lots of ways. This is a study done years ago, 30, 40 years ago, by a researcher named Walter Mischel, who was at Stanford University, and he did this rather diabolical experiment where he would take 4-year-olds into a room, and they would sit at a desk, and on the desk would be a plate and a marshmallow and a bell. And he would give them this challenge. He would say, I'm going to leave the room. If you wait until I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows. But if you want that 1 marshmallow, you can ring the bell and I'll come back and you can have it. And so he was trying to see how long these students could wait. And then over the years, he continued to follow these students, and he found that the students who were best able to wait for those marshmallows when they were 4 were doing better as high school students and college students and adults. So it's just one small indicator of how these non-cognitive skills, things like persistence, perseverance, ability to delay gratification, how those pay off later in life. There have since been much more complex and large-scale studies that have showed the same thing, that students who display conscientiousness and self-control at age 7 or age 9, in adulthood they are not only more likely to be employed and earning money, they're more likely to stay married, to avoid bad debts. All of these skills early on pay off later on.
So have there been any scientific study of the character itself, of the one person's character?
Well, I mean, it depends how you define character. So I think that character is, what we call character, is really a collection of these skills. And so it is skills like conscientiousness, skills like self-control, skills like persistence. And I think part of using the word character, and I do in the book, is a little bit tricky, because I think a lot of people think of character as something that is just innate in us, that never changes. Some people have a good character, some people have a bad character. And what I'm trying to argue in How Children Succeed, and what I think a lot of the people I'm writing about are saying, is that in fact character is made up of this collection of skills and habits. And these are things that absolutely we can change. We can practice them, we can develop them, we can improve them. And I think that's a barrier for a lot of people to both in terms of understanding this field, but in terms of for actual children, it's a barrier for them in terms of developing these skills, because their instinct is to think, I've either got this or I don't.
What was the main reason behind looking for answers on how children succeed? Obviously, it is a $1 million answer, but is there a specific experience that has triggered the whole thing?
For me?
Yes.
I think it was two things. So my first book is called Whatever It Takes. It was about an educator in Harlem named Jeffrey Canada who did great things to develop this whole system of education and support for a 96-block neighborhood in Harlem. And I followed him in his schools for a couple of years, and he was very focused on these standardized test scores, and so I was as well as a journalist. I sort of, if you read that first book, a lot of the narrative device that I used was how well his students did on these tests. But then after that book came out, I started talking to economists and psychologists who were really questioning this intense focus and saying, well, you know, maybe that's not the best way to teach students. So for me, that really challenged what I'd been thinking for a few years. The other, I think, event that really pushed me in this direction was 5 years ago, my wife and I had our first child, just as I was starting work on this book. And I think becoming a parent made these questions so much more personal for me. And so pushed me to want to try to understand the science and the reality behind how children succeed.
Speaking of parents, you do put a lot of importance on early childhood intervention. So what is the role that parents play?
They play a huge role, I mean, especially in the early years, but I think all the way along. So one of the sets of research that I wrote about is the research on attachment, that in the early years, in infancy, the first 12 or 18 months of life, there are two things that have a huge effect on how children develop, and especially how they develop in this non-cognitive dimension. One is the amount of stress that they experience. A lot of children, especially in low-income neighborhoods, experience what doctors call toxic stress, stress that is intense and chronic, and that really debilitates their development of their stress response system. And what that looks like in teenage years and in adulthood is difficulties with impulse control, difficulties with self-control, with sitting still, all of the things that we come to call character strengths. They have their roots in the stress in those early years. The other thing that happens in those early years is attachment, the forming of a close, secure bond between a parent and an infant. When children get that, they tend to develop much better in these realms. When they don't get that, when they don't have a secure attachment, it really hampers their development of these skills. So in terms of early years, I think those are the most important things that parents can do: protect their kids from toxic stress, develop a secure attachment with them. When their kids get older, and when we're talking about, you know, children in primary school or even secondary school, I think it's more complicated, and I think that at that point we need to push our kids more, you know, to pull back a little bit, to allow them to accept challenges, to allow them to fail. I think for a lot of the parents who I've talked to, that is the biggest challenge. It's very hard for us parents to accept our children's failures, but the reality is that, you know, failure is part of success. Unless children learn in childhood how to fail, how to deal with setbacks, how to bounce back from those defeats, they go into adulthood without this important strength. And when we don't let our kids have those little failures and deal with them in the right kind of way, we're really shackling them.
I'll come back to the issue of the environment, but I want to ask more about practice. Can character skills be taught in the classroom, and how?
I think they can be taught, but I think it's a complicated question exactly how. And so some of the educators who I've written about are taking this on in a very explicit way. So I wrote about this one school that's developed a character report card. They have 7 character strengths that they assess their students on. And they talk about these skills all the time in the classroom. So you know, when they're studying a book in English class, talk about the protagonist and which of these skills he has. When they're talking about historical figures, they do the same thing. Even in math class, they find a way to work in these skills like grit and curiosity and zest. I think that's part of the answer. I don't think that is necessarily the whole answer. I think what is more productive for teachers to do is to figure out the right way to challenge students, to give them the experience of being pushed a little bit, pushing themselves, trying things that are a little outside their comfort zone, and sometimes failing, getting critiques, revising their work, doing long-term projects. All of that sort of approach, I think that actually helps develop these character strengths more effectively than just talking about them. I think talking about it helps, especially I think with older students. They're at this stage in life where they can really think about their own mental processes, and so asking yourself, do I have self-control? What does that look like? What does it look like in my peers? That's a useful experience. I don't think it's enough. I think we also have to change the way that we teach, the way we organize our classrooms and our schools, to give students these opportunities to challenge themselves, to work on things over a long period of time, and to have that experience of failing and bouncing back and succeeding.
But does this mean a radical change in teaching approaches? Because schools are oriented towards cognitive skills. And you have said that reform based on content has failed to affect achievement gaps.
I think it is a pretty radical change for some schools, what we're talking about. And I think what's more important is that it is what we need is a pretty thoroughgoing change. So a lot of the schools that I write about in my book are private schools or charter schools, meaning public schools in the United States that are run by separate entities. And I think I'm not writing about those schools because I think that those are the most important kind of schools. I'm writing about those schools because they have the biggest ability to change. They're very autonomous, they're very independent, they can change things. And I think a lot of public schools feel like they're caught in this system where there isn't room for independence or experimentation. And I think on a public school level, there really does have to be a culture shift where teachers have to change, schools have to change, parents have to change, students have to change. That doesn't mean we can't start small. There are certainly ways, I think, for any individual teacher to go out there and do things tomorrow that do a better job of developing these skills in students. But I think the real solution is pretty big scale change.
Did you ever consider dropping out of the education system?
I not only considered it, I did. So I write in the last chapter of my book about my experience in college. And I dropped out of college twice, finally dropped out altogether and became a journalist. And it was when I became a journalist that I really, for the first time, felt this sense that I was getting the kind of education that I really wanted. I had been in this very demanding, high-pressure high school that in lots of ways gave me a good education, but at the same time I think was making it hard for me to have those experiences of pushing myself, of challenging myself, of learning things that I hadn't tried before.
Coming back to the issue of environment, obviously the environment that children grow up in affects the development of non-cognitive skills. But is it really a matter of poor and rich kids?
No, it's not. I mean, I think that, again, I was very affected by this research on stress. I think that the amount of stress in a household has a lot to do with how well students are able to develop these skills. I think there is a correlation between toxic stress and family income. When children grow up in low-income families and in violent neighborhoods, they're more likely to experience this kind of stress and trauma early on that makes it hard to develop these skills. But certainly it's not a complete correlation. There are lots of low-income families where parents are doing a great job of forming those secure attachments, of protecting their kids from that kind of toxic stress. And on the other side, there are plenty of high-income families where children are under tremendous stress, where families are breaking down, where there is abuse or neglect or substance abuse in the home, all of which cause a great deal of stress to kids. And even without that, even the sort of pressure to achieve in a narrow way that I think a lot of high-income young people feel is remarkably stressful. And I think it's part of the reason why kids from those families often struggle.
So obviously this is the evidence on perseverance, I can say. Well, finally, how does creativity, as we are here in a place discussing the topics on creativity, link in with the character skills that you have mentioned?
So I think one of the ways that they do is in terms of what children do with creativity. So I would say two things. One is I think when we remake our schools to allow students more opportunity to work on challenging projects over the long term rather than go from worksheet to worksheet, subject to subject, assignment to assignment, I think that gives them better opportunities to be creative. And it sort of forces them. You know, they're not just doing exactly what someone tells them to do. They have to figure out, what is this project? What do I want to do? What do I want to create? That's part of it. I think the other part is that sometimes when we focus on creativity, we think that it just means giving students the opportunity to have lots of freedom, to think broadly and laterally and come up with crazy ideas, and that's part of it. But I think we also need to help students understand that the other side of the creative process is turning those brainstorms into actual productive work. You know, if you talk to any creative, successful creative person, they'll tell you there's two sides to the creativity equation. We need to help students learn how to brainstorm and have a lot of freedom, we also need to teach them how to train their mind to turn those brainstorms into something productive. So for me, getting that equation right is the biggest gift that we can give to students.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.